The world had gone to hell. Dr. Alice Sinclair stared in horror as the city streets descended into chaos. Twisted, deformed creatures swarmed through the rubble, their guttural roars echoing across the devastated landscape. She had to get out of here, but everywhere she looked, people were being torn apart by the mutated, ravenous horrors. Adrenaline surging, Alice sprinted down the crumbling sidewalk, her white lab coat billowing behind her. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her own research, the very work she had devoted her life to, had been twisted and perverted into a living nightmare. Turning a corner, Alice froze as a group of the monstrosities shambled towards her, their dead eyes fixed on their prey. Choking back a terrified scream, she darted into a nearby alleyway, her heart pounding in her ears. The alley was a dead end, and Alice pressed herself against the grimy brick wall, praying the creatures wouldn't find her. Suddenly, a hand clamped over her mouth, and Alice nearly cried out before a familiar voice hissed in her ear, "Shh, it's me. Stay quiet." Whirling around, Alice found herself face to face with her colleague, Dr. Michael Garrison. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by a wild, haunted expression. "Michael, what's happening?" Alice whispered frantically. "How did this get so out of control?" Michael's grip tightened on her arm, his eyes darting nervously. It's my fault, Alice. I made a deal with the wrong people. I thought I could control it, but now everything's fallen apart." His voice cracked with guilt and terror. Before Alice could respond, a chilling screech echoed from the mouth of the alley, and the mutated creatures began to pour in, their jagged claws and gaping maws seeking fresh prey. Michael shoved Alice behind him, pulling a handgun from his jacket. "We have to get out of here. Now." Firing a barrage of shots, Michael carved a path through the horde, Alice close on his heels. They sprinted down the alley, the creatures' howls of fury hot on their trail. Rounding a corner, they burst out onto a broader street, only to find it overrun with more of the twisted monsters. "This way!" Michael yelled, grabbing Alice's hand and dragging her towards a half-collapsed building. They scrambled through the debris, the sound of shattering glass and snarling jaws closing in behind them. Reaching a darkened stairwell, Michael shoved Alice ahead of him, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a bent metal pipe. Gasping for breath, they pressed themselves against the wall, listening to the enraged cries of the creatures outside. "Michael, what have you done?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "How could you let this happen?" Her colleague's face was etched with anguish. "I'm so sorry, Alice. I was approached by a group of powerful people. They promised me funding, resources, influence. I thought I could control it, use it to our advantage. But it all went wrong, so terribly wrong." A deafening crash echoed from the door, and Michael's eyes widened in terror. "We have to keep moving. Those things won't stop until they find us." Grabbing Alice's hand, he led her up the crumbling staircase, the sound of shattering wood and tearing metal thundering behind them. As they climbed higher, Alice realized with sinking dread that they were trapped, and the nightmarish creatures were closing in, hungrier and more relentless than ever. Asterisk, the nightmare has only just begun. Asterisk, the stairwell was a claustrophobic gauntlet of terror as Alice and Michael raced upwards, the enraged shrieks of the mutated creatures echoing behind them. The stairs shook under the weight of the pursuing horde, and Alice couldn't help but glance back, her stomach twisting with pure primal fear. "Keep moving," Michael yelled, his voice hoarse with exertion. "We have to get to the roof. There might be a way out." They burst through a doorway and found themselves on the top floor, a narrow catwalk leading to the rooftop access. Michael surged forward, but Alice faltered, her legs trembling from the strain. I can't keep going," she gasped, her lungs burning. Michael whirled around, his eyes wild. "Alice, we don't have a choice. Those things will tear us apart if we stop." He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her along, but she wrenched free, her gaze darting around desperately. There has to be another way, Michael. We can't just run forever. We have to find a way to stop them, to end this nightmare. Her voice rose in desperation, and Michael's expression darkened. There is no other way, Alice. Don't you understand? This is our only chance. He grabbed her again, yanking her forward, but she dug in her heels, shaking her head. No, I won't go. I won't leave them to those monsters. She turned and raced back down the stairs, ignoring Michael's panicked shouts. Crashing through the doorway, Alice found herself face to face with the twisted horde, their gaping jaws and gleaming claws mere inches from her. Letting out a terrified scream, she whirled around, only to find the stairwell blocked by more of the creatures, their eyes fixed on her with primal, ravenous hunger. Trapped, Alice pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding in her ears. Michael. Michael, help me, she cried out, but there was no response. Glancing up, she saw her colleague had barricaded the door, sealing her off from the rooftop. A chilling realization dawned on her. Michael had abandoned her, chosen his own survival over hers. Betrayal and despair flitted through her as the creatures surged forward, their twisted, mutated forms closing in. Squeezing her eyes shut, Alice braced herself for the end, praying it would be quick. But the savage attack never came. Instead, a thunderous roar shook the building, and the creatures let out a cacophony of agonized shrieks. Cautiously, Alice opened her eyes, and what she saw made her heart skip a beat. The mutated horde was in disarray, their attention diverted by a new, even more terrifying threat. Alice's breath caught in her throat as a hulking, nightmarish figure emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes and gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. This was no ordinary zombie. It was a twisted, mutated monstrosity, a product of the very research she had devoted her life to. And it was ripping the other creatures apart with ease, its savage, bestial fury unleashed upon its former kin. Trapped between the warring horrors, Alice realized with dawning horror that she had nowhere to run. Betrayed by her own kind, she was now the prey in a bloody, nightmarish battle for survival. And the only way out was through the jaws of the apocalyptic beasts that now ruled the city. Alice pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding as the monstrous behemoth tore through the horde of mutated creatures. Jagged claws slashed and massive jaws clamped down, sending dismembered limbs and gore flying in all directions. The deafening roars and agonized shrieks echoed through the stairwell, making Alice's ears ring. In the chaos, she tried to make a break for the exit, but a twisted, deformed creature blocked her path, its milky eyes fixed on her with predatory hunger. Scrambling backwards, Alice felt her back hit the wall, and she cowered as the creature lunged forward, slavering jaws gaping wide. Suddenly, a powerful force slammed into the zombie, sending it careening into the opposite wall with a sickening crack. Alice stared in stunned disbelief as the hulking, mutated behemoth towered over her, its glowing eyes narrowed with what seemed like recognition. The creature let out a rumbling growl, its massive head tilting as if studying her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Alice thought it might attack her, but instead, it turned its attention back to the horde, swatting aside the smaller mutants with ease. Realizing this was her chance, Alice took off, sprinting towards the exit. She burst through the doorway and found herself on the rooftop. The city's devastation spread out before her in a nightmarish panorama. Smoke billowed from shattered buildings, and the distant screams of the dying echoed across the urban wasteland. Gasping for breath, Alice whirled around, looking for a way to escape. But the only exit was the stairwell she had just fled, and it was now blocked by the hulking, mutated behemoth, which had fought off the other creatures and was now slowly stalking towards her, its massive form silhouetted against the ruined skyline. No, 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 Alice breathed, her mind racing. She couldn't go back the way she came, and there was no other way down. She was trapped. Glancing around frantically, She spotted a fire escape on the adjacent building, its rusted metal ladder just within reach. Without hesitation, Alice scrambled over the edge of the roof, gripping the ladder and beginning to descend. The heavy footsteps of the mutant creature grew closer, and she could feel its hot, fetid breath on the back of her neck. Forcing herself to move faster, she climbed down the creaking, unstable ladder, her muscles burning with exertion. Just as she reached the ground, a massive clawed hand shot out, snatching at her leg. Alice screamed, kicking frantically, and the creature roared in frustration as she slipped free, tumbling to the pavement below. Ignoring the pain, she pushed herself to her feet and ran, her ragged breaths echoing in the eerie silence. As she fled, Alice couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the hulking mutant had spared her life. Why had it not simply torn her apart? What was the meaning behind its strange, almost, protective behavior? The questions swirled in her mind, but she knew she couldn't afford to dwell on them now. Her only focus was survival, escaping this nightmare, and finding a way to stop the horror she had unwittingly unleashed upon the world. Alice's heart pounded as she sprinted through the deserted, debris-strewn streets, the ominous silence broken only by the distant echoes of chaos. She had escaped the monstrous behemoth for now, but the respite was fleeting. She knew the twisted horror would be prowling the ruined cityscape, hunting her relentlessly. Turning a corner, Alice nearly collided with a group of ragged, terrified survivors. They eyed her warily, their gazes shifting between desperate hope and deep-rooted mistrust. "Please, you have to help us," a frantic young woman cried out. "We've been hiding, but the creatures, they're everywhere. We can't stay here any longer." Alice opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of shattering glass and inhuman shrieks cut her off. The survivors scattered in a panic, and Alice found herself once again alone, the nightmarish howls drawing ever closer. Ducking into an alleyway, she pressed herself against the grimy wall, listening intently. The mutated creatures were relentless, their savage cries echoing through the deserted streets as they hunted for any remaining pockets of humanity. Alice shuddered, realizing that she was now as much a target as the other survivors. Crouching low, she began to move cautiously down the alley, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. As she rounded a corner, a hand clamped down on her shoulder, and she stifled a scream, whirling around with fists raised. "Easy, easy," a gruff voice hissed. "I'm not one of those things." Alice blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and found herself face to face with a weathered, heavily armed man. He eyed her warily, his grip tightening on the rifle in his hands. "Who are you?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "Name's Jack. And you're—" He arched an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over her. I'm Alice. I worked at the research facility. This is all my fault. Her voice caught in her throat, the weight of her guilt threatening to overwhelm her. Jack's expression softened, and he gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Hey, don't beat yourself up. From what I've seen, this isn't just your doing. There's a lot of blame to go around." His eyes darkened. "But we can't focus on that now. Right now, we need to focus on staying alive." A thunderous roar in the distance sent a chill down Alice's spine, and Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "That thing's still out there, isn't it?" he muttered. Alice nodded, her mouth dry. It saved me, for some reason. But I don't know why, and I don't know if it will do it again." Jack's jaw tightened, and he gestured towards a nearby doorway. "Then we better find a more secure place to hole up. Come on, I've got a few others holed up in an old warehouse. Maybe we can figure out a way to put an end to this nightmare." As they hurried towards the dubious safety of the warehouse, Alice couldn't shake the lingering questions about the mutant creature. What was the nature of its twisted intelligence? And why had it not killed her when it had the chance? The answers, she knew, could hold the key to stopping the apocalyptic horror that had been unleashed upon the world. The old warehouse was a dim, cavernous space, its high ceilings casting long shadows across the cluttered floor. Alice followed Jack as he navigated the maze of rusting machinery and discarded equipment, her ears straining for any signs of the mutated creatures. Reaching a barricaded doorway, Jack pounded a coded rhythm, and the makeshift barrier slid open to reveal a small group of survivors huddled inside. They eyed Alice warily, their gazes flickering between her and Jack. "It's all right. She's with me," Jack said gruffly, ushering Alice through the doorway. "We need to hunker down and figure out our next move." As the door slid shut behind them, shutting out the eerie silence of the city, Alice took a moment to study her fellow survivors. There was a palpable tension in the air, a deep-seated mistrust that had undoubtedly been forged through the horrors they had endured. A middle-aged woman with a determined glint in her eye stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over Alice. "Who is she, Jack? And how do we know we can trust her?" Jack raised a hand, his expression hardening. "Look, we're all in this together now, whether we like it or not. Alice here has some inside knowledge about what's going on. If we're going to have any chance of surviving this, we need to work together." The woman's lips thinned, but she nodded reluctantly. "All right, but I'm keeping an eye on her." She turned to Alice, her tone clipped. "So, what can you tell us?" Alice took a deep breath, trying to ignore the weight of their scrutinizing gazes. I'm a scientist. I was part of the team that developed the research that led to these creatures." She paused, her voice wavering with guilt. It was supposed to be a breakthrough in regenerative medicine, but somehow it all went horribly wrong. Now, the city is overrun, and those things are hunting us all. A shocked murmur rippled through the group, and the woman's eyes narrowed. "You mean to tell us that you're responsible for this?" she hissed. No, it's not like that," Alice protested, her hands trembling. "I never intended for any of this to happen. I was betrayed. My own colleague, Michael, he made a deal with some powerful people, and now everything's fallen apart." Jack stepped forward, his expression grim. "That's enough. Pointing fingers isn't going to help us right now. The important thing is that Alice might be able to help us understand these creatures, and maybe even find a way to stop them." The woman's jaw tightened, but she nodded grudgingly. "All right, fine. But if she puts one toe out of line, I'm not responsible for what happens to her." As the group fell into an uneasy silence, Alice couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake in revealing her connection to the disaster. But she knew that if they were going to have any chance of surviving this nightmare, she would have to trust these strangers, and they, in turn, would have to trust her. The fate of the world, she realized, now rested on their fragile alliance. The tense silence in the warehouse was shattered by a sudden thunderous crash that sent the group of survivors scattering for cover. Alice pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as the sound of shattering glass and unearthly roars echoed through the cavernous space. "They found us," the woman from earlier cried out, her voice laced with terror. "We have to get out of here now." Jack's face was set in a grim expression as he clutched his rifle. "We can't run. Those things will tear us apart out there. We have to stand and fight." Alice felt a rising panic. But how? How can we possibly stop them? These creatures, they're inhuman, unstoppable. Her voice cracked with desperation. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Maybe not. You said you worked on the research that created these things. You must know something that could help us." Alice's mouth went dry as all eyes turned to her. I don't know. The research was meant to be a breakthrough in regenerative medicine, not this. I never anticipated anything like this could happen." The sounds of the mutated creatures grew closer, their guttural snarls, and the thud of their massive bodies slamming against the walls, sending terror coursing through the group. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "Well, you better figure it out, fast, because if we don't find a way to stop them, we're all dead." Suddenly, A towering, hulking figure emerged from the gloom, its glowing eyes fixed on the cowering survivors. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the monstrous behemoth, the same creature that had spared her life earlier. The other survivors raised their weapons in terror, but Jack held up a hand, his expression cautious. "Wait, I think it's after her." The mutant creature let out a rumbling growl, its gaze never leaving Alice. Slowly, it began to advance, its massive, clawed feet shaking the ground with each step. Alice felt paralyzed, her mind racing. What did this thing want from her? Why had it not killed her before? And why was it seemingly protecting her now? As the creature drew closer, Alice realized that it was different from the other mutants. There was a glimmer of intelligence in its eyes, a savage but almost deliberate manner to its movements. An idea began to form in her mind, a desperate gamble that might be their only chance. Steeling her nerves, Alice stepped forward, ignoring the protests of the other survivors. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I think I know how to stop them." The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as if in recognition. Alice took a deep breath and met its gaze, hoping against hope that her plan would work. "If I'm right, then you and we're the key to ending this nightmare." The mutant creature loomed over Alice, its massive form casting a towering shadow across the warehouse. The other survivors looked on in stunned disbelief, their weapons still raised but hesitating to open fire. Alice took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the creature's glowing eyes. "I think I know why you're here," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You're not like the others, are you? There's something different about you." The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its head tilting slightly as if in response. Alice felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this twisted, mutated being could understand her. "You and were connected somehow," she continued, her hands trembling slightly. "The research that led to your creation. It was my work. And I think that's why you spared me, why you're here now." The creature took a step forward, its massive claws flexing. Alice steeled her nerves, refusing to back down. "If I'm right, then you and we might be able to stop this, to end the nightmare that's been unleashed." Behind her, Alice could hear the other survivors murmuring in confusion and disbelief. Jack's voice cut through the din, laced with a tinge of skepticism. "What exactly are you saying, Alice? How can this thing help us?" Alice turned to face the group, her expression earnest. "This creature, it's different from the others. There's a level of intelligence, of self-awareness, that the other mutants lack. I think it's because of my research. The regenerative properties we were trying to unlock, they've manifested in this creature in a way we never anticipated." She paused, scanning the faces of the other survivors. "If I can somehow connect with it, maybe I can use that to our advantage. To find a way to stop the spread of these creatures, to undo the damage that's been done." A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant, echoing cries of the mutated hordes. Jack's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on his rifle. "And what if you're wrong? What if that thing turns on us?" Alice's gaze returned to the towering creature, its glowing eyes now fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I have to try. This is our only chance. Our only hope of ending this nightmare." Without waiting for a response, Alice turned and stepped towards the mutant, her heart pounding in her ears. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, but it did not attack. Instead, it seemed to almost recognize her, its massive head tilting as if in curiosity. Reaching out a trembling hand, Alice placed it gently on the creature's muscular forearm. A jolt of electricity seemed to pass between them, and she felt a surge of adrenaline as the creature's eyes narrowed, its gaze boring into her. In that moment, Alice knew this was their only hope. Somehow, someway, she and this twisted, mutated being were connected. And if she could unlock that connection, She might just be able to save the world from the apocalyptic horror they had unleashed. The air crackled with tension as Alice stood before the hulking, mutated creature, her hand resting on its muscular forearm. The other survivors watched on, their weapons raised, but their fingers hesitating on the triggers. Alice felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins as she stared into the creature's glowing eyes, searching for any glimmer of recognition, any hint that her desperate gamble might pay off. Suddenly, the creature let out a rumbling growl, its massive head tilting slightly. Alice felt a strange sensation, a connection that seemed to flow between them, as if the creature was communicating with her in its own primal way. Her breath caught in her throat as flashes of images and sensations flooded her mind. A sense of confusion, of primal hunger, and beneath it all, a deep-rooted anger. The creature had been twisted, corrupted, its natural instincts and intelligence warped by the varied research she had dedicated her life to. "You're trapped, just like us," Alice murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're a victim of this nightmare, just as much as we are." The creature let out a rumbling growl, its massive head dipping in a slow nod. Alice felt a surge of hope. Perhaps there was a way to reach this twisted, nightmarish being, to turn it against the very horrors it had become part of. Steeling her nerves, Alice turned to face the other survivors, her expression resolute. "I think I know how we can stop this. But I'm going to need your help, all of your help." Jack's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on his rifle. "You're telling me we're going to work with that thing, after everything it's done?" Alice raised a hand, her gaze pleading. "I know it seems impossible, but I think it's our only chance. This creature, it's connected to the research, to the source of the outbreak. If we can use that connection, we might be able to find a way to undo the damage, to stop the spread of these mutated creatures for good." The woman from earlier stepped forward, her expression skeptical. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? These things are relentless, unstoppable. How can we possibly hope to defeat them?" Alice took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We're going to use the creature's own power against them. I believe that if I can channel its abilities, its connection to the source of the outbreak, we might be able to create a counteragent, something that can neutralize the mutation and stop the spread of these horrors." The other survivors fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Jack's gaze shifted between Alice and the hulking creature, his expression torn. "If you're wrong," he began, his voice laced with trepidation. "I know," Alice interrupted, her voice firm. "But we don't have any other choice. This is our last chance, the only way to end this nightmare and reclaim our world." Turning back to the mutant creature, Alice reached out and placed both hands on its massive arm, feeling the strange connection between them pulsing with power. Taking a deep breath, she steeled her nerves and prepared to embark on the most perilous gambit of her life. "All right," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's do this." The fate of the world now rested in their hands, as Alice and the twisted, mutated creature prepared to confront the apocalyptic horror they had unwittingly unleashed upon the world.